There are some stories that stick with us. Stories that we hear in childhood that we carry with us for the rest of our days. Sometimes it will only be a fraction of the story, a little detail that touches a part of your soul. Or sometimes you remember a story because of events in your own life that it happens to correspond with. This story has stuck with me from childhood because of small, bizarre details that my little brain couldn't understand. I've spent years trying to find this story, and serendipitously, I found it. After a random conversation with a family member, I realised that I was not the only one who had been deeply impacted by this story as a child. And I also found out that I'd been looking in the wrong place. Through my research, I discovered that the family involved in this haunting had written a book that was only published locally in their small area of Ireland. But somehow I found a copy of the book being sold by an obscure bookseller on eBay. This is the story of the Reawakening. Jackie and Esther Fahey had a son and a daughter, Michael and Martha. They lived in a housing estate in Corrib in County Galway, Ireland. Michael was engaged to be married to a girl called Mary, and they were living in their parents' home while they saved for their wedding. It started with a smell in the house. The family were plagued by the stench of rotting flesh and urine, and they searched the house from top to bottom looking for a source, but to no avail. They eventually concluded that the smell must be gas or a chemical leak, so they contacted the local authority and had the house inspected. There was no discernible source for the smell, and the family and the professionals were baffled. At the time, they did not suspect anything supernatural, but looking back, it is now clear that this was where their trouble started. After about a month, the stench disappeared, and the family forgot all about it. Michael and Mary were due to go on a weekend away, and had been busy painting their bedroom before they left. The night before, they were awoken by a light that shone through the blinds on their window and illuminated the entire room. They were confused and couldn't understand where the light had come from. They found no source, and it was too bright to be car headlights. In the end, finding no obvious answer, they just retired to bed and headed off on their journey the next morning. While her son was away, Esther decided that it was the perfect time to give his room a deep clean. You know, a proper mother's clean. She bustled up with the hoover and was immeasurably annoyed as they had left paint peelings all over the floor. She moved about, cursing their laziness, sucking up the crunchy peelings, when she realised that what she was hoovering up was not in fact paint peelings. The floor was covered in eggshells. Like someone had peeled tens of eggs and scattered the shells all over the floor. She had no clue what was happening, or indeed how it happened, so she just cleaned it. Michael and Mary returned home from their jaunt and retired to their room to put their bags away. But not long afterwards, Michael burst into the kitchen to speak to Esther. "Ma'am, who's been in my room? There's eggshells everywhere." And thus began a strange battle with eggshells that would appear in increasing numbers all over the house. The abundance of eggshells coincided with noises that would keep the household awake each night. Between 1 and 3 a.m, the family would be awoken by footsteps running through the house. Initially, they believed that it was floorboards. Or maybe they were just trying to convince themselves that what they were hearing was natural nighttime noises, rather than something more sinister. That was until whatever was in the house began to take an interest in Sarah Louise. Martha had had a baby girl called Sarah Louise, and she lived in the house alongside the family. She was their pride and joy and was loved and adored by the whole household. The noises would often begin or end in Sarah Louise's bedroom, and strange bangs and knocks would come from her room in the middle of the night. But there was never anything untoward or worrying to be found. One night, Mary and Michael returned from the cinema to find Martha hysterically screaming in the street, being comforted by a neighbour. They flew out of the car and grabbed her, terrified of what was happening and trying to get sense from her, but she was deathly pale and gripped with terror, screaming about Sarah Louise. The neighbouring girl told them that Martha had burst into their house begging for someone to help her, that someone had her baby. Mary, without thinking, ran full pelt into the house and into Sarah Louise's bedroom. The room was noticeably ice cold, but Sarah Louise was sleeping peacefully. Mary quickly and gently picked up the sleeping baby and made her way through the house. As she passed the bathroom, the toilet flushed and the door slammed. The house was empty and she fled. Earlier that evening, Martha had put Sarah Louise to bed and retired to the sitting room to watch TV. It wasn't long before a thump from the baby's room reverberated through the house. Martha jumped up, thinking that Sarah Louise had somehow fallen from her cot, and ran upstairs to help her. The thumping became louder and more frantic, as though someone was wrecking the bedroom, and when Martha got to the door, she could not open it, as though someone was forcibly keeping her from her child. Sarah Louise was screaming by this point, and so was Martha, from sheer desperation. She fled to her neighbours, and that was when Mary and Michael arrived home. The family were now in turmoil, and reconvened nervously in the kitchen, at a loss as to what to do, and in some ways hoping that the answer was a home intruder. Michael decided to phone the police. He sat down next to the telephone and lifted the receiver, and the temperature in the kitchen dropped to an icy coldness. With his breath billowing out in front of him, Michael became acutely aware of a tapping sound beside him, as though someone was sitting at the kitchen table and was becoming increasingly impatient with his foolishness. The phone was disconnected. They couldn't call anybody, and a crash came from the fireplace. They investigated and found a picture of baby Sarah Louise upside down and smashed in pieces. As they stood in shock and terror, trying to make sense of what was happening to them, a silver picture frame floated from the fireplace and was hurled against the wall and smashed into pieces. They grabbed what they could and ran from the house. Michael, looking over his shoulder, watched as the coffee table flipped over and crashed into the ground. That night, they drove 140 miles to Waterford to hole up for the night. The next morning, Jackie rang his neighbour to see if things had calmed down in the night. They hadn't. In fact, what had happened in the hours after the family left had caused such a stir in the street that people came out of their houses to watch the strange events unfold. Their night had been disrupted by lights flashing on and off, furniture audibly crashing around the house, and most disturbingly, the piercing, shrieking cry of a baby. Except the house was completely empty. The family were in Waterford, and many of the neighbours had watched them flee earlier in the night. The family, of course, had no option but to return to the house. They had jobs, and couldn't just pack up and leave their world behind. They agreed to return, but all slept in the same room, fully clothed and with bags packed, ready to flee if they needed to. All was quiet at first, and then Michael received a call from RTE. Radio Telefís Éireann is Ireland's national radio and television service, and Michael regaled the whole story on national radio. If nothing else, the family hoped that someone would hear the story and be able to help. The nation was gripped, and the radio station was inundated with calls from people extending their sympathies and telling their own horrific stories. That night, Sarah Louise slept peacefully in her cot until 2:45 a.m, when the house was filled with the sound of her frantic wails. The family went to her room to find that Sarah Louise was sitting up in her bed, with her stuffed animals arranged in a perfect circle all around her cot. The family were frantic, but felt that their prayers had been answered when the Bishop of Galway, Dr. O'Loughlin, agreed to visit the house and conduct a mass to try and help them. The mass was scheduled on the 6th of May 1997 and was strictly family only. Neighbours gathered to say a rosary before the mass commenced, and the bishop walked through the house blessing each room. The family gathered in the sitting room to commence the mass, and as the bishop prayed, a soft wail began from Sarah Louise's room that grew into the unmistakable cry of a baby. Sarah Louise was in her mother's arms in the sitting room, and there was no one else in the house. The bishop grew paler and paler and began to stammer through his prayers. The crying continued the whole way through the mass, and the family were stuck, frozen in terror. As the mass ended, Jackie turned to the bishop and said, "What are we going to do? What is this?" The bishop inhaled deeply, refused eye contact, and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't hear anything. There is no human explanation for this," and left. The family received no comfort or peace from the mass. The terror continued, and the family were witness to objects being hurled through the air, and the incessant wailing of the phantom baby continued. They called the radio station again, and were again inundated with calls of sympathy, but no solutions. At their wits' end, the family were taken in by assorted neighbours, and Jackie and Esther visited the local authority for help. They just simply couldn't live in the house anymore. The local authority refused to help, and a mass from the bishop had had no effect. One afternoon, a journalist from the Evening Herald called and requested to stay overnight in the house. The family obliged. Aideen Sheehan was a sceptic and was sure to let the family know that she didn't really believe that there was anything in their house. Again, for the family, it was a way for them to try and get their story out there and maybe find someone that was able to help them. Aideen arrived with her photographer and was somewhat bemused by the family's practice of all sleeping in the same room, but agreed to participate for the purpose of authenticity. At 11 p.m, footsteps were heard in Sarah Louise's room, followed by thumps and crashes. The family and reporters entered to the familiar sight of a room ransacked. Later in the night, the family had moved to the kitchen so that the reporter could write her notes. A crash came from the sitting room, and the reporter was the first to enter and visibly recoiled in shock as she looked around at the room completely destroyed. A large porcelain dog had been smashed to pieces. The TV was moved to the other side of the room, and in the middle of the floor was a smashed picture of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Aideen Sheehan went on to write an article about her night of terror in Ireland's most haunted house, but Sarah Louise's toys would continue to be stacked and moved in odd and deliberate ways. In one instance, Michael awoke in the morning to use the toilet and found all of Sarah Louise's bottles stacked on top of one another in the bath. They recognised that Sarah Louise was the centre of all the problems, and they pinned a holy medal to her chest on the inside of her jumper, but later noticed a perfect burn mark in the shape of the medal and knew that they would have to leave the house for good, for her safety. But someone was watching this story unfold, and it was someone unexpected. And that someone would go on to be the only person who was able to help this family. They were returning home after yet another fruitless trip to to see another holy person who again claimed to be able to help. They were exhausted and pulled into their drive to see a woman waiting for them. Sandra Ramdani introduced herself as a psychic medium and said that she could and would help the family if they would let her. They readily agreed, because at this stage they would have taken the help of anyone. She wasn't what the family had imagined a psychic medium to look like. She was stylish, with short bleach blonde hair and leather trousers. She filled the house with warmth and confidence and assured them that baby Sarah Louise was in no danger. She conducted a ceremony with them, after which the family reported that the atmosphere and temperature in the house literally became warmer, and they felt the presence disappear. They were elated. Sandra then sat them down and told them a story. Many years before the building of the house, a farmhouse had stood on that spot. Sandra had had a vision of a woman of the cloth, a nun, becoming pregnant, and the father of the baby was a bishop. The baby had been murdered and buried beneath the floorboards of the house by the bishop and the girl's father to avoid a scandal. Sandra asked whether there had been any renovations in the house. There hadn't, but the house next door had had large-scale renovation work around the time that Sarah Louise was born. Sandra believed that the renovation work and the new baby in the household had been the perfect storm for creating the haunting. She believed that the haunting began with eggshells because they're a symbol for rebirth and new life, and that the baby had played with Sarah Louise and also become jealous of the attention she received. While Sandra told them the story, there was a knock on the door. On the doorstep was a sheepish young man. He looked up and said, "Look, I know you don't know me, but I've seen your story, and I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that my family owned this land before your house was built. There used to be a farmhouse here, and the family in it had a daughter who was a nun. And look, I don't know what happened in that house, but there were rumours. And I do know that it was haunted, and weird stuff happened all the time. I suppose we thought when the house was knocked down it would all stop, but it didn't. I'm sorry, I should have come to see you sooner."